Hello, new day. Um, hopefully, um, you're understanding a little bit better as we go through these different powers of the federal government, actually, and state government, because that's what we're going to go through today. We start to have a little bit better understanding that um, there are different names, there are different locations. I'm hoping that inherent powers are making a little bit more sense as I provided more and more examples. Again, inherent powers you're not going to find in the Constitution. And when you don't find it in the Constitution, it's not delegated. And if it's not in the Constitution through a delegated power, it can't be implied through the necessary and proper clause. So that is something that is actually the federal government's doing, but there's no place that says they can. So moving on, we started talking a little bit about, we got through the delegated, enumerated, and express powers. We talked about implied, we talked about inherent. What I want to do today is I want to go through this additional power. I mean, I know we've got concurrent and prohibited. I'm not going to go into those quite yet. I want to go into reserve powers today, and I want to talk a little bit more about how when they created this new system, they agreed that the federal government would take certain things and they would control those items. And then the states, being that they were the power, they held the power under the Articles of Confederation. And we talked about Jefferson and how he worried that taking too much away from the state might allow the federal government to continue to expand its power to eventually take over the states. And so the Constitution was written in a way that protected the states. And we go back and we talk about it took some time to ratify the document because there were certain states that were a little bit hesitant about the Constitution Articles 1 through 7, even with the Federalist Papers trying to nullify or give some reassurance to the states, that was not necessarily going to work. So we go back and we look at Madison. Madison came up with 12 ideas. 10 become the Bill of Rights, 1 dies out, it's the size of the House of Representatives, and that 12th idea that he had in his 12 original proposals, that becomes our 27th Amendment. But we're going to go back now and we're going to look at that 10th Amendment, because that 10th Amendment is really vague. It is limited in what it says, but it means a whole heck of a lot. So if I read the 10th Amendment as you're looking at it with me, I'm going to get my highlighter out. Powers that are not delegated, meaning they're not listed in the Constitution. So powers that are not listed in the Constitution, nor prohibited to the states. Now that's Article 1, Section 10. So if it's not listed in the Constitution, and it is not part of Article 1, Section 10, anything else is reserved respectively to the states. Okay, sounds great, but it gives no depth. So the struggle is moving forward, what does that mean? And how is that going to be carried out? And for quite some time, probably up until the Great Depression, it made sense. The federal government did its thing and the state governments did their thing. Now I'm just going to pop onto a couple different PowerPoint that I came across today. Was like when I was just trying to make sure we had everything we needed. And I know this is a lot to look at, but that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to move this so that we can look in this upper corner here. I had pointed out that reserve powers are around certain categories like health, safety, welfare, morals, and education. And I think the big one as we start is this one. Okay, nowhere in our Constitution does it say anything about education. And so because nothing is in our document about public education, that power became something the states took over. And it still is today. And we look at the difference between state standards. We look at the difference just between the different states on what kind of testing they do. I've got friends in Texas and Oklahoma. Man alive, some of those standardized tests are insane. MCAs in comparison, I can't imagine that. I mean, I think they would be content to look at our MCAs. In fact, I look back during the Reagan administration, Ronald Reagan actually wanted to delete or eliminate the Federal Department of Education. And his reasoning for doing so, not because he wasn't pro-education, he was actually pro-state rights. And his rationalization dealt with the fact that education isn't a federal power. It's not a concurrent power. It is a reserved power. So why would the federal government even have a Department of Education if the federal government shouldn't have their hands in on education in the first place? So education is a super example of what is a reserved power. Nowhere in the Constitution does it talk about education. I'm going to flip back to this particular screen here, and we're just going to look at a couple of these items here. Marriages and divorces. Marriages and divorces are regulated by the state. There is no national law as to everyone who gets married in the United States has to follow a certain expectation. There's no issues when it comes to divorces. And you can go to Nevada and you can do a marriage through a drive-through. And then some states, they require blood tests, they require a waiting period. It really is dependent on the states themselves. Now, some of you might be thinking, wait a minute, what about when the issue of same-sex marriage came about? Well, first it was the federal government that addressed the issue of same-sex marriage, and they did so in terms of a constitutional protection, because what was happening is people who work for the federal government, people who were in different gender marriages, they were getting benefits. Example being health insurance coverage, life insurance, beneficiaries. There were items that were literally being provided to married couples that same-sex couples weren't having the same opportunity to enjoy those rights. And so the federal government stepped in. The lawsuit originally was against the federal government in terms of federal employees and wanting to be able to have same-sex couples be treated with employment benefits the same way that heterosexual couples had those benefits. And the court came back and said yes. So what was left was, can states individually determine if same-sex couples can marry or not? And it's not until 2015, in the case of Obergefell versus Hodges, that the Supreme Court took up the issue and said that it is a constitutionally protected right to marry who you choose. And that actually abolished any state that was rejecting same-sex marriages. So it's not that the federal government gave permission. The court determined that the Constitution protects a person's right to choose who they marry. So the United States was not, the federal government was not involved in that, besides the fact that they were party to a lawsuit. And so states still regulate the marriage and divorce laws. Our speed limits. Okay, we look at going back to my slide, looking at, if I can get this to move, safety issues. When we start talking about safety issues, health issues here, we're talking about the difference between one state and another. I go to one state and the speed limit might go much higher than it is here in Minnesota. Or we cross the border into another state and it says this is the penalty for not having your seatbelt on. Another one is texting while driving. Another one is, I think it might actually be on this. Oh, yep, there it is. And now I went and popped that out. Oh, that's not even good. Going back to this, the regulation of alcoholic beverages. And we're going to get into that when we start talking about how the federal government has the ability and how they got very unique in how they fund states and pulled in that issue of alcohol and blood alcohol content, because for many years it was dependent on the state. Well, it still is, and I will explain that. But it the age for drinking and the blood alcohol content, um, that's a state decision. And we look at that and go, well, why do all 50 states have the age of 21? Federal government got very creative, and I'll go through that in another lesson. So, looking at this, we already talked about the public schools, license requirements for professionals. We talked about that already, and I said that if I wanted to go teach in Wisconsin, I would actually need to take a few classes because Wisconsin has certain professional requirements for me. One thing we're seeing right now is the need for medical personnel in New York. And you may have heard on the news how they're saying we're going to waive some of our professional requirements for medical. And that is so that they can bring in reinforcements to help them and get around whatever the differences are between the state professional requirements. So we're actually seeing reserve powers in action right now. Conducting elections. Every state holds their own elections. The federal government sets the date when the elections will be, but the states then oversee the process, carry out the process, decide how the ballots will be, what are the requirements to get on a ballot. That's all just differentiated by the states. And the idea of local elections or local governments, how local governments are funded, how the state oversees local governments. That's all individually by the states. And I'm going to pull up another one. And we're going to see some things double up here. Regulate trade and businesses. This is a key here. As long as it is what is called intra, I-N-T-R-A, intrastate businesses and trade and movement of goods and services, as long as it never crosses a state line, the state can regulate it. But the minute a product or a service crosses a state line, now the federal government gets involved, and that is now called interstate, I-N-T-E-R. Big difference between I-N-T-R-A and a big difference to that is I-N-T-E-R. One is within the state, one is over the borders. So this one also talks about public schools, professional requirements, the alcohol. I mean, this one is also a new one, the regulation of guns. Why do some states allow them to have not a conceal and carry? I mean, there are some states where you can go and the guns right there, you can see it. It's not concealed at all. That's a difference between the states. Okay, that is a reserved power. There was one more here, I think. Create and watch over schools, local governments. I think we're starting to see a pretty big trend here. Here's the other one that I wanted to bring up. Powers that belong to the state governments, because it was never delegated directly to the national government. And it's not in Article 1, Section 10, so it didn't deny the states these powers. Again, we're starting to see some duplicates. Local governments, schools, marriage, divorces, adoptions are interesting. Intra, there's that INTRA, commerce, trade. Protection of fire and police protection. Who pays for that? That's up to each individual state. And there's your professional license requirements. When I was in Oklahoma over spring break, we were talking, my friend and I, and how there's a difference between how states actually fund education. They are different districts in Oklahoma, but the teachers are all in the states. They're all connected through the state union, not individual district unions. So that's a big difference as well. So when we go back to my PowerPoint, which isn't quite as exciting as those other ones, we start to see that there are quite a few differences. Now we look at this issue too, morals. When we get into morals, this becomes the difference of the death penalty. Some states have it, some states don't. It's all dependent on each individual state. The death with dignity laws, giving someone the ability to terminate their life because of a terminal illness. Some states allow it, some states don't. the issue of legalization of marijuana and whether it's recreational or medicinal or none at all. Again, up to the individual states, because those issues were never delegated, probably because they weren't even thought of at the time. So they're not delegated, they're not listed. Now, could there be an issue over the inherent powers that the federal government uses because of the federal government? Yeah, and I think one of the best examples of this is one that I'm going to pop up here, is the Affordable Care Act in its infancy. Right after the Affordable Care Act got passed in 2010, there were states immediately filed lawsuit against Obama and the federal government. And the reason that they were doing so is right here. The law challenged on the grounds that the individual health insurance mandate exceeded what Congress had the power to do, and the complaint further alleged that it violated the 10th Amendment by forcing the states to follow a federal regulation that many states said that's not our responsibility. So that is why we've seen the Affordable Care Act in front of the Supreme Court on a number of occasions. And so if I look at it again, here we go. Right away, we had a whole group of states joined together in a joint lawsuit, a big group lawsuit, to tell the federal government, you've overstepped your boundaries. Congress passing the Affordable Care Act and Obama signing it into law, and then telling the states, you are going to need to enforce this, and you're going to make sure that all people in your state are getting this or are following this. It went over like a barrel of a false is what happened. And so I just pulled up another little article here for us to look at. Oh, yeah, I'm good at this. Now I hit another button, don't know what I just opened. Over half the states are suing Obama on this issue for the immigration issue. The video I showed you, SNL, how executive orders work. When President Obama signed the executive orders allowing for individuals, this is really driving me crazy, my apologies, allowing for undocumented immigrants to stay in the United States, states started suing immediately the federal government because Obama, according to the states, he was doing something that he didn't have the power to do. So they were challenging, was there power there, and was he exercising something that he was doing, but by Constitution wasn't supposed to be doing. So there's many examples where this gets challenged. He would create a new work program that allowed undocumented parents and legal permanent residents to obtain. I mean, people were very, very angry that, here it's 12 states, the District of Columbia got very frustrated and said, what gives the president the right to force states to allow these undocumented workers, undocumented immigrants, to stay in our state, and we provide basically a place for them, and you're saying they get to stay for how long? The states are like, that's not your right in doing so. So there was lawsuits on that as well. So it's a very contentious issue, and states are not likely and frustrated that they want to do things their way. We're actually seeing it kind of backwards now, with the president saying that states need to provide and find their own health care during the coronavirus, and that states need to have to look for protective equipment, ventilators, and masks, and that's pitting state against state. And people are saying this is a national health crisis. Should the national government be involved? And it actually becomes an issue of federalism. Whose responsibility is it? So as weird as it is that we talk about federalism as something that's in the Constitution that the framers came up with over 200 years ago, the idea that we're seeing it live in action right now is actually kind of cool. Yep, there goes my she's kind of crazy person again. My husband telling me I need to need a hobby, but it's so interesting to see that there's still a fight against who has power, the federal government or the states. So finish this video up, take the few little questions that go along with it, and we will move on to another video. And in that video, we will talk about the difference between prohibited and concurrent powers, and we'll finish up this section and this module on the powers of government. Have a great day.